In this video we're going to look at how to replace a flap seal. If you've already looked at our how to replace a dart seal video, you'll know that's quite simple. A flap seal is slightly more complicated. First thing you have to do is to remove the screws that hold in the retaining plate or the retaining strip. If you peel back the edge of the seal, you can see the screw heads, and then you can actually get a screwdriver onto them and work your way around the plate, removing the screws. What we generally recommend is that you work your way around 3 sides of the plate, not 4 sides of the plate, and then just very much to loosen the the fourth side, just to make sure that the plate doesn't actually fall off. Depending on the size of the door, there will be a range of different screws, and obviously you just have to keep working around one at a time, removing them all. It's quite fiddly, takes a while. Once you've got all the screws off of 3 sides, if you gently pull the seal downwards or sideways away from the retaining plate, the flap sits behind the retaining plate and will sort of pull out if you lift it very gently and sort of pull it away. Once you've got off, as you can see here, we've actually undone 3 sides of this plate, so you leave the 4th side attached and then pop a couple of the screws back into the sort of left hand edge here, or one of the sides, just to again stop the plate falling out while you're working your way around the seal and to give it some stability. So having popped a couple of screws into the plate, just hold it in place. You can then remove the screws from the final side of the plate. So we're just sort of popping these screws out and then work your way down. Useful to have somewhere to put them. We're putting them on the countertop, but normally if we're working on a lot of fridges at one time, we normally have a box on the floor we just drop the screws into to make sure they don't get lost. Sort of keep tabs of what's going on. A little bit fiddly, as you can see. Unfortunately not quite as straightforward as a dart seal, but fortunately flap seals are not as popular in the market as a dart seal either, so you won't see as many of these as you're likely to see of dart seals. There we go, it's the last screw just coming out of the bottom, and having got that out, you can then gently ease the seal off the final side, and that pulls off quite easily. Just find that last screw, put it back up on the countertop with the rest of them, and then the seal just comes off. Then you get the new seal, and you have to open up the flap at the back of the seal and ease it over the edge of the metal plate. This bit can be quite fiddly because if you're trying to sort of lift on one edge, another edge will come off. And you have to be sort of holding the the flap open at the same time as putting it over the edge, so it does take a little bit of practice, but once you've got it going, it generally goes on quite easily. One thing I would point out is you need to be quite careful here. The edges of these plates can be quite sharp. Our sort of operatives quite often end up with sort of some slight cuts on their hands if they're not too careful with these things. Again, working along one of the free edges, get the seal attached across the top and down the sort of top of one side, just to give yourself something to work on and keep the seal in place as you're installing it. Having lined up the top and made sure everything's in place, it's then quite sensible to actually pop some screws in and retain the top edge to make sure it can't come out as you start working your way around the other edges. And what you may have to do here, depending on the seal replacement you're using, there may be more rubber going down the back of the plate than there was previously, so you may need to just sort of push something through the holes to give yourself a guide for the screw holes. In this particular instance, we just got a bradawl, nothing more clever than that. Here we go, pick up the bradawl and we'll just literally make sure the seal is lined up and pop that through the hole to give ourselves a sort of hole through the rubber, which helps to both retain the rubber in place, but also it just sort of keeps it in place while you sort of screw it up. You have to be careful at this point that you don't actually lift the seal off of the plate when you're trying to lift up the front of the flap to put the screw in. So yeah, it is a little bit of a fiddly job. This is perhaps why the majority of the fridge manufacturers in more recent years have moved on to the dart seals, which simply push in and peel out. There we go, so we just pop that first screw in and then work through putting the rest of the screws in. Just keep lining the seal up and making sure it's sort of nice and neat as you go along. The key thing is obviously keep retaining the plate so the plate doesn't come off and fall on the floor. Another option for those who are prepared to sort of take the whole thing out, you can take all of the screws out and lift the whole plate off, complete with the seal attached to it. Put it on a bench, flat down or on the floor, but bench is probably more hygienic. And peel the seal off of the whole plate once you've taken it off, and then ease the new seal on, and then offer the whole plate complete with the seal back up to the door. Different fitters work in different ways. You simply have to find out the way that works most efficiently for you. Okay, so we've now got the top nicely restrained, so that's not going anywhere, and the seal is going to stay in. So working down the sides, again just sliding the flap behind the plate, making sure the rest of the seal stays in front. Work down both sides and just keep sliding it down. It's a very fiddly job, but not overly difficult. You just have to make sure the flap part goes behind the edge of the plate and the rest of the seal sits in front. So it's, you see here we're just sort of easing that bit on down the edge. Very difficult to get the video camera in, unfortunately, to show exactly what's happening. But if you imagine you have the flap, which is a piece of rubber on the back of the seal, which has a sort of opening, you need to slide that flap behind the plate and the rest of the seal in front, so you end up with the flap, which is going to be the bit that holds the seal in place, neatly behind the plate, and everything else sitting in front of the plate. Work your way down to the corners on both sides and then fit across the bottom. Be especially careful down at the corners, because that tends to be where the really sharp edges are, and you can certainly sort of cut fingers there if you're not too careful. As you can see, it does look a bit fiddly. This takes a little bit longer than a dart seal would take. We would normally recommend to replace a normal size sort of flap seal would take anything up to 10 or 15 minutes, purely because of making sure it goes on properly, depending on how you do it. Some of the fitters that we've seen work can do it slightly quicker, but they do remove the whole plate, and then they have the problem of fitting it back on and keeping the seal on the plate while they refit it, which has its own issues. So just sort of work that down the sides, make sure it's sort of still neatly lined up and square at the top, and then just feed it in. You can probably get a better view here, and it's sort of popping the screws back in along the bottom, having slid it underneath there, just to make sure that it's sitting square. Quite fiddly getting these screws in, unfortunately. But once you've sort of put all the screws in, you just have to work around the whole process, popping all the screws in one at a time. Quite time consuming, which is why it takes sort of 10 or 15 minutes to actually achieve one of these. Sometimes you have to use a bradawl to sort of puncture the rubber and make sure you can get the screw right in. Other times you can just simply screw into it, depending on how it actually works out. So a magnetic screwdriver will be quite handy here, but it's just one of those jobs that you just have to take time over and work your way through. So having got all the screws back in place, put the sort of final ones in, make sure it's all neat and tidy, make sure it's neat and sort of tap, and that's basically a flap seal fitted. I hope you find that useful. Make sure the door shuts properly and move on.